I think we are beginning. So we'll just give it a minute for people to enter the virtual room. I presume because it's lunchtime, you'll have your cup of tea and your biscuit to hand, your little bit of sugar rush. So again, we'll just give it a few minutes. The etiquette of these things is always slightly different, isn't it? Because in real life, we would be just pulling out chairs, excuse me, and getting ourselves settled in. So genuinely, this is the first time we have done a webinar launch for our National Social Monitor. So I'm really thrilled that so many of you could join us on what is a Monday in May, which isn't always the most high energy day of the year. So I'm really pleased that there's so many of you that were able to come and again, just look at this publication with us. I may possibly launch into my introduction. And I think the key thing with this is that we do at least one or two national social monitors a year. And what we're trying to do is take a particular topic and look at it through a particular lens. So the National Social Monitor, we take 10 headline topics: housing, health, education, skills. We'll see them as we run through it. The document should hopefully be online now as well at 1:30. And we're looking at it and saying, well, what would that look like through a lens of care, lens of just transition? They're the last two, I think, that we've done. So with this particular one, we're looking at what would housing look like if government is to deliver on its programme for government on securing our future. Now, the caveat here is that the programme for government is 162 pages long. Our recently published socio-economic review is 335 pages long before you even add in any of the annexes that come with that. So this is really, it's not so much random, it's not so much that things are ranked in a particular order, but it's just looking at one or two little bits and pieces that fit into a small document that we think could help government deliver on programme for government. And again, just to pick up on that word fairness as well, I think if you think back to yourself as a little kid or think about any little kid that you know, it's one of the first concepts that we really grasp as little kids. Nobody's more obsessed with fairness than a 4-year-old. So we seem to either have lost the meaning of it or lost the strength of it as we grow up. So it's a really, really, really important word. What do we mean by fairness, and what would that actually look like if we deliver on programme for government? And this caught my eye that I'm reading Municipal Dreams, The Rise and Fall of Council Housing by John Boughton. And he just has one sentence here: the ideological labels matter less. The dominant thrust for most working class voters was a simple belief in fairness, fair wages, proper treatment, help when needed. And actually, it's a much more radical notion than it sounds when it's politically mobilised. So again, with just that in the background, I am going to hopefully share my screen. Fingers crossed now everybody can see this. So we should be in. I hope somebody will message me or put the hand up or come in on the chat if you can't see that. So that, as I said before, it's our National Social Monitor. We're looking at those 10 key headlines through a particular lens. And this was, again, looking at programme for government, but saying how can we deliver programme for government and how can we do it fairly? And as I said, it's a huge document. Our National Social Monitor is also quite a big document, even though it's a much slimmed down version of our socio-economic review. And there will be lots more in the document than I'm going to pull out today. So it's just really to look at one of the options under each of the headings. So I'm going to quickly run through these. I'm going to start myself on a stopwatch to keep hopefully within some sort of time. So the first one on our list is always housing. I mean, really, housing is integral. I think all other rights, all other options for a decent, good life flow from having secure, stable housing. Programme for government does acknowledge the urgency of the housing crisis, and it commits to delivering 50,000 housing units annually, which, as far as we're concerned, still really falls short of fully addressing both the existing deficit and future demand. So we've seen in the other reports, especially even from the OECD, that this commitment really doesn't fully reflect total housing need. What we pinpointed with this one, I suppose, is the interaction of housing and poverty, and particularly with those within the private rented sector. So what we saw, Parliamentary Budgetary Office, who do incredible work, they had a really interesting piece there from 2023. And then in the period between 2012 and 2022, we saw wages rise by 27%, which really sharply contrasts with rents, which surged by over 90% in that same period. So what we can see is that wages are not keeping up with our most basic of costs, which is the roof over your head. And this information here is from the Central Statistics Office Survey on Income and Living Conditions. And it just highlights the disproportionate vulnerabilities of renter to poverty. So again, if you can see any of those, with extra forms of housing, social support such as HAP are particularly at risk of poverty after they pay their rent and mortgage interest. Again, I keep coming back to this, I suppose, in a government with a budget surplus, a government that has money to spend, this cannot be allowed to continue. Our policy priorities then in housing, again, much broader than the piece we've just looked at. We really need to be looking at the right type of supply. We need to be looking at a reduced reliance on the build to rent sector. It has its place, but it shouldn't be a primary place. This is the key one, is to set a target of 20% of all housing stock to be social housing. And again, this really needs to be done, excuse me, through the local authorities. In terms of that low income household and the rent pressures, I suppose the rent tax credit, turn it into a grant or make it refundable. And also really looking at how are we going to build these houses that are committed to in programme for government. So you are looking at things like promoting modern methods of construction, and again, looking at sort of some sort of target as well to actually make that a reality. We'll move on to health then, which is, again, I suppose is the second most important thing in general, but hugely important to all of us in our lived realities. And I focus on this one in aging, and I don't know whether that's a personal preoccupation at the moment, but just looking at Ireland aging as a country, our demographic shift, and how are we going to plan for that? How is programme for government going to deliver for all of us who choose to make Ireland our home as we age into that? How are we actually going to be supported in aging in place, in aging at home? So the key thing as well is that as we get older, it's about those healthy years. It's about staying healthy and active and connected to our communities for a much longer span of time. And again, just to really hit home as well, that living longer, having more and more old people is such a success story. The language tends to be around pension burdens, pension time bombs, care burdens, bed blockers, those kind of things. This is a really, really, really positive change in any country to have people who live longer and live healthier for longer, but it does need to be supported. So again, it's those healthy years that really must be the policy priority, and planning for that will really require a different approach to healthcare. So we do welcome the commitment to develop that multi-annual funding approach for our health service. Population is growing and it is aging. So what we can see as well is that 15% of the population are aged 65 or older, which is an increase of 22% from census 2016. And those are much projected, I suppose, then to come to 1.9 million of us then by 2057 who will be aged 65 plus, with a huge increase in those who are old. So 85 plus will move from 84,000 to 396,000. And again, that comes with particular care needs. So good home care, good long-term residential care can help reduce the lengths of stay of people in acute hospitals. That is not what an acute hospital is for. This really needs to be bedded into our system. So again, what we're looking at is the amount of hours of home support, which would combine home care packages and home help that will be delivered across the country. And what we're seeing though is that just 58% of targeted intensive home care packages were delivered, and again to only 31% of the number that had been targeted, which is actually a decrease from the previous year's performance. So a lot of work here to be done. And our general health asks, and again, there are much more of them, but in this particular document, to look at a statutory entitlement to home care. And I appreciate again that would need to be funded and resourced and implemented. and allowing us to remain at home and to remain in our communities for much longer, and really to look at the process of planning and investment so that the healthcare system can cope with the increase and diversity in population. Education is our next one, and what we saw again in Programme for Government, that was it commits to tackling all forms of disadvantage in education. So this is really, really, really key. Early school leavers, whilst a small number, I suppose, in terms of percentage, as somebody said, for those particular individuals, this is 100% of their lived reality. So in generally speaking, Ireland does quite well in terms of access to education, and those of us who go through second level education, those numbers are all up all of the time. But what we are seeing, I suppose, is that there is a cohort who are being left behind. And what we're seeing is that there is an impact right the way through life then for leaving school early. So that would be, and again, just to clarify, that is individuals whose educational attainment is a lower secondary or below. So it would be intercert, junior cert and below, that would be classed as leaving quite early. These individuals then, unfortunately, the impact, as I said, it does continue out through life. What we're seeing is less and less of them will be employed compared to the general population, and they're not economically active. And I suppose, again, I know education tends to be geared towards careers and jobs and work. It is much more than that. So education should really open up what options are available to you, to critical thinking, how you engage with the world, your language skills, all of those things. But in terms of education leading to a career and education leading to a job, this early school leaver, that they're definitely being left behind. And what we can see then is that when they do enter employment, that their earnings are much, much, much lower. And again, when we look to forward planning, the digital transformation will absolutely disrupt the labour market. And even if we just see things like self-scans in the supermarket, so the job of scanning the supermarket shop hasn't necessarily been automated, it's just transferred from the boy or girl behind the checkout to the customer. But again, all of that is disrupting how work is distributed across society. So again, in terms of education, we really need a wide range of access options as well to education and training. So meeting people where they are, putting those supports in as well at levels that people can actually access and understand will be key. And again, it needs to be resourced and funded correctly. So this is, again, just about better access to higher education from students from areas of socioeconomic disadvantage. And again, looking at that thing really about meeting people where they are, much more about apprenticeships, much more about lifelong learning, much more about the sort of skills and educational outcomes that will actually bring meaning to people's lives as well. And when we look at primary schools and secondary schools, really need to be looking at reducing class sizes and pupil teacher ratios, and ideally the younger classes is really where we need to be putting that resource in, because that's what makes the biggest difference. If we look then to rural development, there is a programme for government commitment to balanced regional development, which is really, really welcome. Access to services and infrastructure is one of the key challenges that faces rural communities, and policy must be rural proofed, and delivery of public services in rural communities must be in accordance with that equivalence principle. And what we can see is, and again, anybody who's familiar with this will know this is the reality, that the at risk of poverty by area type factors in the higher rates of poverty and deeper rates of poverty once you get out into rural Ireland, which is again not what you're looking for in a wealthy Western country and a government that has a budget surplus. So the CSO, again, great, amazing work that we can see from that, where there is this massive gap, higher rates of regional and rural poverty. And again, if we look to our colleagues then in the Messel, the Vincentian Messel Research Centre, their work shows that the cost of living is basically higher as well for rural families. So it can range from again, these are estimates, either €51 a week higher for working rural couples, or actually, and it can go up as far as 99 per week higher for rural couples with children in primary, secondary school levels. And those costs are related to household energy, transport, fuel, and food. And they will all be much more expensive purely by virtue of living in rural Ireland. And again, what we're seeing is the types of jobs that are available in rural Ireland, tend to be seasonal, tend to be much lower paid, tend to be less secure. And COVID, there was massive conversations in COVID about opening up work from home, that you were able to keep a high paying job and move away from cities and into rural Ireland. Excuse me. So really what we're looking, I suppose, is that, the income disparities, the regional disparities, a lot of implementation, a lot of resourcing is going to have to be put into place if our rural future is to be achieved. So again, our asks here that investment is balanced in between and within regions. High-speed broadband, cannot say enough about that. That's the reason we're all, chatting here today. A just transition, again, really, really important that the benefits of burden of change are shared equally and fairly. And transport. As soon as you mention transport to anybody outside of a major city or a hub, that is really, really key. And that hopefully would remove the costs related into having to keep a second or possibly a third car on the road as well for rural Ireland. Work is our next topic. The commitment and programme for government is to create 300,000 new jobs by 2030, which is highly ambitious, considering that we have nowhere for people to live. So that is going to have to go in tandem with other infrastructure supports, such as housing and definitely the transport piece as well, and access to healthcare. What is a concern, I suppose, is that the long-term unemployment. Now, the rates and numbers generally of unemployment are falling, which again is fantastic. We are a country at full employment, however that's decided upon, but it is again at the risk of leaving a small cohort of people behind. And if anybody remembers the 80s, we had, we could see there really the dangers and the long-lasting implications of large numbers of people trapped in long-term employment. So whilst this is, again, a conversation about infrastructure, it really will have to be looking at what kind of supports are needed to upskill and reskill anybody in terms of long-term employment. There's lots of conversations now as well about reducing or getting rid of any sort of mandatory requirement for retirement at a certain age. So all of those, as we age through upskilling and reskilling, long-term unemployment does seem to impact younger people and older people. So at either end of the spectrum, where maybe your CV is a bit sparse, you haven't got much experience, or alternatively, your CV and your skills may possibly be out of date. So again, it's looking to see at a country where, again, we are at full employment. We're looking to make sure that people can access good quality jobs as well. That definitely is part of the conversation. It can't just be any job for any cost. It needs to be sort of living wage appropriate. It needs to be secure and stable and fulfilling, ideally. So our policies across work then, youth unemployment particularly, and you are looking at education and literacy initiatives as well as retraining schemes. OECD work, I think, from the end of last year, and our colleagues in NALA will attest to this as well, that again, the cohorts with low level numeracy and low level literacy will need to be brought to a certain point before they can be brought any further. Integrating training and labour market programs, and again, just making sure that the skills that you are receiving are relevant and up to date. Everything is now digitalized, everything is online, everything is click and paste and upload. These things can take a little while to get used to. So again, anybody, the older workers facing pre-retirement years in unemployment, that's a real challenge to be able to get to be brought to a certain point and then hopefully moved beyond that. Governance and participation is our next heading. And for this one, we sort of concentrated, I suppose, on democracy, maintaining democratic systems. And in order to do that, you do need to have genuine participation. You do need to have everybody able to have their say. And whilst we have universal suffrage, which is that people who are eligible to vote, registered to vote, can vote, what we're not really seeing is the people that we are voting for don't necessarily represent the population at large, and women are significantly outnumbered by men in politics. We do have gender quota legislation that was introduced in the 2016 general election, and it has resulted in general increases, but women still only hold 25% of seats. And research from the National Council of Women in Ireland reports that care was not an issue for only 40% of female respondents. So these were local councillors and key stakeholders, compared to 54% of male respondents. So what we're seeing really is that this is a conversation, I suppose, about care, about the types of roles and responsibilities that women traditionally, non-traditionally have, and I suppose again, kind of unpaid childcare that really impacted on the ability to women to go out and canvass, that women were actually much more likely to bring their children with them on the campaign, and they were much more reliant on care supports than their male counterparts. And again, what we see then is that lone parents would seem to be specifically disadvantaged by these dynamics. So this is a conversation about democratic systems, about participation, but it's also about what supports we need to put in place to allow everybody to participate. So we are looking for increased investment in early childhood education and care and after school care. And again, when we look at governance and participation across the country, PPNs, always to the foremost, need to be resourced, need to be I suppose, and supported to ensure that capacity building is an integral part of their process. Income distribution, this is always, again, another key one for us. What we're seeing is, again, a country where the headlines are, we are at full employment, we have a budget surplus, everything is fine, we have bounced back from our COVID pandemic, lockdown, recession. But having said that, then we went straight into a cost of living crisis. We've gone straight into energy prices going through the roof, and also, wars that are at the edge of Europe, and wars across the world that are having an impact. So the amount of money, I suppose, that people have in their pockets, the true value of that is what it actually buys you. What does it get you when you go to the supermarket? Can you put the immersion on? Can you have a hot dinner? Can you put the kettle on? Can you have some toast? So that is really the key thing when it comes to income distribution. Benchmarking core social welfare rates is key to that, to make sure that anybody who's reliant on social welfare for all or part of their income doesn't fall further behind, especially at times of economic growth where that pull away from average wages happens. So benchmarking is really going to be I suppose the key to making sure that our poverty rates don't fall further behind. Our key ask is always that indexation be linked to 27.5% of average earnings. I could do another 4 hours on why that is. It's all in the SEO, it's all on our website. That's our figure. But I suppose what you can see here clearly from the chart, if you can make the chart out, hopefully it's big enough, is that if social welfare was to be benchmarked at 27.5% of average weekly earnings, then weekly job seekers payment at this particular moment in time should be set at about €266. It's at €244. So straight away we have a shortfall there. And again, if you have a shortfall in an income that's quite low, you are going without the basics. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind. Again, if we look to the CSO's recent silk figures, we can see that deprivation is on the rise. So going without is a real issue for households in Ireland in 2025, which is an absolute scandal. So our key asks index social welfare rates and introduce refundable tax credits, so that's for low income households who are in work, that they would get the full advantage of changes in budget. Taxation, this is the bit I imagine everybody was waiting for. But again, it's a key part of how we function as a country, how government works. And corporation tax, again, is the hot button topic. And it's really about fairness. So I think this is the one really where fairness is the key. And what we're seeing is that the latest data from the revenue commissioners on corporation tax, so these are published in 2024 with a return date for 2022. We've 92,500 corporate taxpayers who paid 23.8 billion in corporation tax for 2022. Now, the world is in flux. We do not know what that is going to mean going forward. We don't know necessarily how long we're going to be able to gather in these large sums of money. We had Parliamentary Budgetary Office released, I think, only this morning to say that, we've spent more than we've earned this year, which for your household's not a good thing. Government, it's slightly different. But again, this over-reliance maybe and this presumption that these huge sums of money are going to continue to flow into Irish coffers, we're really going to have to look at how we raise money in order to be able to do the things that we want to do as a country. So in taxation then, our key asks would be to set a new tax take target, increase the overall tax take to reach this target. And that does not necessarily mean that it's going to be from my wage slip and from your wage slip. There's lots of other ways of increasing overall tax take. And I think, again, one of the fairness ones would be the corporate tax rate, and that minimum 15% to be implemented. Environment and sustainability then. Ultimately, climate change is one of the most pressing challenges we face. How we're going to adapt to it, how we're going to mitigate it, how we're going to manage this transition. How we do these things now will in large shape the type of world that we live in. And is it Mark Fisher, the author, when he talks about sort of capitalism and politics, and it's that thing where we're constantly told that things are impossible when they're not, and that things can't be done when they can. I think he puts it much better than that. But the world we live in is really as a result of decisions we make. And when we look at the environment and sustainability, the Sustainable Progress Index and the SDGs, a big piece of work for us every year. And the Sustainable Development Goals are due to be delivered in 2030. So that gives us the same time frame as this current programme for government. So it's going to be really interesting to see how much work will be put into developing and implementing and resourcing the goals, and especially now because we're into the final 5 years of the goals. And as we can see here, based on the work that we do every year, this is back in February, we ranked 9th overall across the goals. So again, plenty of work to be done there. Our asks across this are looking for emissions reduction targets, and again, looking right the way across the system for this. This is more than just agriculture and housing and transport emissions. We will be looking to pilot a farm sustainability passport scheme, and again, really looking at honing in on the Sustainable Development Goals, because they cut right across every issue for every group, and looking at where does responsibility for them lie, who's going to deliver on them, and really pushing forward in the next 5 years for that. And the last topic then is global issues. It is concerned that the programme for government only makes one reference to overseas aid, and that is to be found in protecting our environment section. There is a commitment to ensuring continued support for climate finance delivered through Ireland's overseas development aid programme, particularly in areas where communities are vulnerable to climate impacts. So whilst Ireland is committed to reaching targets for ODA, climate finance and loss and damage, it is critical that the government recognise that these are 3 separate obligations. So that's really important. And again, we've written a lot about that. If you have a look on our website under the migrations and our common home documents, you'll find plenty there. We still lack a strategy for reaching that UN agreed ODA target of 0.7% of our national income. conversations about what our national income, you know, I suppose that could go on for quite a while as well. But we've put together here possible pathways and how that can be achieved. And it can be done. What we're asking as well is that the allocation should not include the increase in expenditure in respect of the Ukrainian crisis. That should be ring-fenced, I suppose, and warehoused separately. And again, it should not include our commitments to climate finance or loss and damage. That's really, really important. So in terms of our overall policy priorities for this, what we're saying is that we need to uphold the value of solidarity, take a human rights first approach to foreign migration and international development policy, really renew that commitment to meeting that UN target. And then again, just make sure that we've disaggregated our commitments to climate finance, loss and damage, separate to the ODA target, and accelerate progress towards fulfilling these commitments. So that is it. That's our whistle-stop tour through the National Social Monitor. It should be up on the website. I will stop sharing and we'll see. Hopefully, you've got some questions for me, because otherwise I will be forced to, I don't know, do some sort of song and dance for you. So thank you. I see there's a few questions here. I'm going to quickly run down through them. So the first one is, the rate of poverty amongst those in rented accommodation on HAP is enormous at 58%. Why do we continue to take this approach when rent is so high? Shouldn't these people be experiencing poverty, be in social housing? Absolutely. And I think that really highlights I suppose, the problem with providing social housing solutions as opposed to social housing. So this reliance on the private sector to provide social housing means that the gap between market rate and what somebody should be paying in their differential rent rate. So again, just in case people don't understand how HAP works, you source your accommodation in the private rented sector, and what you're doing is you're paying your differential rate of rent to the local authority, same as you would if you were in local authority provided social housing. And what's happening is, because the allowances for HAP, the rent that the local authority will pay to the landlord is capped. What's happening is that they used to be done under the table, now they're done over the table, is that the tenant is taking on that gap themselves. So the tenant is usually paying what's called a top up to the landlord. Now, if you're already on low income and you're eligible for social housing, this is really cutting into the amount of money that you have in order to be able to do other things with. So it's extraordinarily high. Like that figure of 58% is really, really, really high. And again, it cuts through the poverty conversation, the deprivation conversation, and also that we really need to see that 20% of all housing to be social, public, affordable housing in whatever shape or form that takes, in order to provide affordable housing for people who are on low income. So thank you very much for that. Let me just see what have we got down here. On the reflections on regional socioeconomic disparities, key trends there, and any asks, recommendations in relation to that. Thanks, Anna. Again, I mean, you can see it. There's a couple of really interesting maps as well. Like Pub will do great maps on their regional disparities. You can see money does tend to sort of hover around the big cities, but you can just see that it's the border, it's the northwest coast, the borders, where there is less and less investment going into, and the bigger counties, I suppose, you can just see it's just the sheer distances between places. Like we were talking before about the national payment strategy and the fact that there has to be X amount of ATMs for X population numbers, and that we can't be a certain kilometre away from certain kilometres away from an ATM. And I appreciate that, there will be certain parts of the country where the nearest town is going to be 20, 30 kilometres in. So there is going to have to be, I suppose, some sort of an adjustment in that. But I mean, the key recommendations really are a lot to do with transport, huge amount to do with access to regular, sustainable public transport across the country. We've done a piece with Irish Rural Link, that's still, I think, waiting to be published, and access to, transport in rural Ireland is key to that. We can see it, that there has been moves, I suppose, to, government departments moving outside of the cities. We were seeing it with the growth of regional educational hubs as well, like that. So that, things do need to be closer to you. But, my own family are from out past Blacksod, and you have to go to Galway or you have to go to Castlebar for any sort of health treatment of any shape or size. So, and there's no direct links to these things. So a lot of it will, I suppose, be down to population numbers. But I mean, the socioeconomic review, Anna, we have tons and tons and tons of stuff in there about that regional disparity piece and what needs to be put in place for regional growth. And one last thing maybe is that the growth in inward migration is impacting positively on rural Ireland. So I think that's also really, really key. Small rural villages that now have a large, maybe a Ukrainian population, where now all of a sudden the school can access extra supports because they have this quite large influx of children from Ukraine. Schools near to bypass centres as well. So like there's a lot going on out there at the moment, and I think maybe people aren't quite as clued into that. I don't know, but there's a load there with the rural stuff. And the next question then, the benchmark against wages. Wages will rise with inflation. So that's generally the way that goes. You'll get inflation, you'll get wages, and then you'll get, so to be able to piggyback on that. And what I don't suppose you want is that when inflation falls, like we've had practically zero, really, really, really low rates of inflation for quite some time. Very, very cheap money in the financial sector for quite some time. But at the same time, wages were still rising, albeit at a slower rate. So that is why we have decided again with the benchmark is to be against average wages, because they will rise with inflation. And again, there's a conversation to be had that once you achieve that, to be looking towards then the minimum essential standard of living basket, because that would be a much more accurate reflection of what it actually costs to live. And I am very conscious, I mean, if I was brave enough doing my pre-budget submissions, the poverty line is €366 a week. So ideally, your rate of social welfare would actually be much, much closer to that. To be able to say, okay, if the roadmap for social inclusion is serious about eradicating consistent poverty down to 2%, child poverty, because child poverty is family poverty, and also with the sustainable development goals, that there, you could argue that you would set your social welfare rate to, at a rate that would keep everybody out of poverty. I don't think I'd get too far, but that is why we link it to the wages and not inflation. Thank you. And again, sorry, I see the question there as well, but the poverty one. So thank you very much. There's a question here about aging. Thank you. Do we have any sense of the future demand on housing, especially amongst older people, and the demand for right sizing? I saw Alone have an interesting piece out this week now about the impact, I suppose, of older people retiring into the private rented sector. So that's a real key issue. In terms of the numbers, the Housing Commission, we have numbers. I don't have them to hand. I do have my SEO here, but I don't have the actual numbers to hand. But it's in the 200s of thousands is the sort of type of housing demand that is currently needed. The future demand then on housing, I know the CSO will do a low, a medium, and a high futures forecast to be able to say. But I mean, the world is in flux at the moment. There's a lot more people moving around and, looking for safe harbor. And again, I think that's another success story that I don't think we really celebrate enough is that Ireland is a safe, secure, stable country. There's educational opportunities here, there's work opportunities here for women. So I just think that, you know, it is an attractive place to come and live and work and excel. Despite all our young people going to Australia, people are coming here because for the same reasons, you know, about different better quality of life and you know, opportunities that aren't available to them in their home countries. So the right sizing piece, I think, is going to be very, very important as well. And that will have to be a conversation about universal design. It will have to be a conversation about aging in place. It will have to be a conversation about the types of homes and where we build them. So you know, in cities and suburbs, that you're now seeing a mixture of 2, 3, 4, 5 bedroom homes plus one or two apartment blocks sort of linked in with them. And you saw it in council housing. Like if you look at the traditional Dublin council housing, the Marinos, the Crumlins, the Cabras, Drimnas, there would have been council houses, and then at old folks flats is what they were called, or probably still are, but little bundles of very, very small, maybe 2 or 3 rooms clustered together, so that, and again, close to the shops, close to the parks, close to the all of the amenities, the bus stops, the churches, the you know, not so much the schools, but the bus stop, you know, that kind of thing, so that they were close to the GPs, and that you were able to move from your home into a smaller place to live within your community, because that's really, really the key, is the planning for that. And I know, and again, I'll have a look and see who sent that, but there's some really interesting work done on right sizing, and that it's a lot more, it is more than just about the logistics of it and the economics of it, that unfortunately, and I can see this myself in kind of family and extended family, unfortunately, when the time comes to right size and downsize, it's almost too late, because nobody in their 80s or 90s is really gung-ho for selling up and moving out and packing through. So a lot of right sizing really needs to be done before it needs to be done. So it probably does need to be a much bigger part of our general overall conversation. Okay, so there's a big question here from Carly. That 58% figure is really, really stark. I think we've had a chat about this. I think, you know, definitely in other arenas, to be able to factor in or take account of those top up payments and the homeless HAP, that looking to see, yeah, where can we access this data? And I'm not too sure. I know that so I'll read this out properly. 58% figure is stark. Is there any way to factor in or take account of the top-up payments being paid to landlords, read those on HAP and homeless HAP? It isn't being recorded and is therefore invisible in the data. What are your thoughts on addressing this? I mean, ideally, nobody should be making a top-up. You know, in an ideal world, everybody who needs and is eligible for social housing is in social housing, and this over-rely, like, you know, somebody maybe has to go on HAP as a temporary measure whilst they know that they're 3, 4, 5 months away from getting a social housing. In the differential rents, we know that each local authority sets their own rent scheme. There was talk, I think, in the previous programme for government about doing a piece of work on that. Certain payments are treated as income in some councils and not for others. One parent families in a HAP tenancy, child maintenance treated as income even when paid sporadically or not at all. Yeah, I know there was a commitment, I think, in the previous programme for government to look at the differential rent system and to put in sort of, you know, a one size fits all, because you're absolutely right, it does depend on the council, and ultimately if the income is the same, then the rents should be the same. And I know that, I don't know whether traditionally it may have been a little piece to do with extra costs in cities or extra costs in rural Ireland, all of these different things, but it's not coherent and it's not standardized. And if you read the Housing Commission report, excuse me, there's an argument there being made that actually the differential rent shouldn't be set as a portion of income. It should be set in relation to how much it actually costs to keep social housing on the road, so that it's much more linked to the management costs of the the building and the area as opposed to income. But what you could argue then is that if you are in social housing, local government owned and managed social housing, and your rent is unaffordable, that that's maybe where a HAP payment type of thing could come in. So that if the government does have to pay rent supports, that the rent supports aren't going into the private sector. The rent supports are basically going back into local government coffers. And I know you can kind of argue that's a roundabout way, but there's an enormous amount of money. I mean, you know that, Carly, the amount of money that's going out of the private sector and into, from the public purse into the private sector through those HAP payments is extraordinary. Yes, and thank you for that. South Dublin County Council have done some really good work re-age friendly housing within communities, and I think that is going to have to be key as we, as we age into this. And again, I'm really conscious of people aging out into the private rented sector, because their income may cover those high rents, but their pension certainly won't. And then we are now back into conversations about who picks up the shortfall. So if somebody aged 66, 67, hopefully they're going to live another 25, 30 years, they are going to live in private rented accommodation. Who's going to pick up the tab between their rent and their pension? Are we going to have to put some sort of a HAP type subsidy in place? Because otherwise the rent is simply unaffordable. And you can see it in the homelessness figures. There's a slow creep of people aged 65 and over accessing emergency accommodation. And I know when we're little, when you're asked what you want to be when you grow up, homeless and poor is not the answer. That is not what we want for anybody in our community, and certainly not as we age, because there are vulnerabilities that come with age as well. And again, you can see that in a lot of the reports that have been done. The private landlord is less likely, and the tenant is less likely to ask, because you don't want to rock the boat, is less likely to put in place any sort of adaptations, any sort of extra supports, be that even, extra handles going up the stairs, adaptations to a bathroom. Those are the sort of things where they're much less likely to actually put them in place. And again, the tenant is less likely to ask for them to be put into place as well, for precisely that reason, that you'd be afraid you'd be thrown out in your ear with definitely nowhere to go. And our demographics are changing. There's smaller families. There's much more people single throughout their entire lives. And again, what you can see in the stats is that it's the single-headed household who tends to be most at risk of poverty, in terms of just trying to keep their basic costs covered. And also they tend to be furthest down the list when it comes to accessing social housing supports. So the fabric of our country is changing, the demographic is changing, and if government is to really deliver on this programme for government, and again, I cannot stress enough, it was a massive document. Between that 160 pages and our 333 pages, there's plenty of cross-referencing that people can do, but this is just really just to have a conversation, just to be able to highlight these are the sort of things that we think would help if government was to deliver on programme for government. And I firmly believe that everybody is working towards the same goal, which is a better country for anybody who chooses to make Ireland their home, that they have access to the basics: roof over their head, food on the table, they can put the heat on, they can put the light on, they have access to transport, they have access to education, they have access to healthcare, amongst, and again, whatever freedoms would come with self-expression, that these are the basics. This is what we want for ourselves and our communities around us. So I'm going to have one more quick scan down through the questions and just see if there's anything else there, if anybody wants to get one in quickly before we go, because I'm conscious now I've done this for nearly an hour and it is lunchtime. People have sandwiches to eat. So I would again encourage everybody to read Programme for Government, read the full thing if you can. I know a lot of us do tend to just do Control F and look for our keywords, but it's really interesting to read the entire thing to see where the links are, where the links aren't. Like one that really stood out for me was we have a commitment to the climate action plan and climate action goals, and then however many pages later, going to get rid of a passenger cap at Dublin Airport. So those two things for me are fundamentally in tension with each other. There's no doubt about that. So again, it's good for us to know what's in it. It's good for us to know what government has promised to do over the next 5 years, because A, it means we can hold them to account, and B, most importantly, when we're doing this work in the advocacy sector, what we're really trying to say is you have committed to all of these brilliant, fantastic things. Let us help you by coming up with ideas and ways of doing it, and bringing all of our expertise to the table, bringing all of our the voices of the communities that we work with and represent as well to the table to deliver on this. And 5 years isn't long. We're nearly halfway through the first year now, and a Oireachtas committee have just been set up. So it's a lot of work to be done in the next 4 point something years. So I think there's no more questions coming through. I'm going to say thank you hugely. As I said, read Programme for Government, read this document, keep in touch again. We are all busy, I think, starting to think about our pre-budget submissions. So that's obviously always, going to relate back to Programme for Government as well to see what commitments are in there. So with that, I'm going to say thank you very much, and we will call proceedings to a halt. Thank you.